Otherwise, if as we're going through it, if you'd like to have a copy of the presentation, let me know. I don't mind PDFing the copy and shooting it. All right. I guess starting off with, my name's Johnny Vermillion. I'm a air program manager with Spirit Environmental. We're a consulting firm based in Houston, Denver. I'm out of the Austin office. We also have an office in Baton Rouge. And then we got a few people that are kind of matrixed out as they come with the company. You know, life happens. You know, wives go to advanced school, they go to medical school, they're in lawyer schools, they get bounced around. So instead of losing some of these employees, we'll allow information to them so we can keep that knowledge. And it works pretty good. It's a good system, I think, for the company. A little bit about my background. I spent most of my life in a regulatory agency, actually. I worked with TCEQ, TNRCC, the state of Texas regulatory agency for between 28 to 29 years. Air permits. Did a lot of advanced stuff there. That was what's called a senior technical specialist. So I was basically the technical support for a lot of the managers and leadership there at the agency. So they do know quite a bit, but every now and then when they would get stuck on an ugly technical issue or issue with EPA, federal, state interactions, that's where I would come in and help. So not only am I technical, but I also got some of the interagency workings. I'm a degree chemical engineer. My PE is in chemical engineering. And so after about 28 and a half years with the TCEQ, I retired from the agency and came to Spirit. I've been with Spirit over 5.5 years now. So I'm seeing both sides of the table a little bit, both from the regulatory side and then from the consulting side, and through working with our clients, you know, finding out their viewpoint. And so I try to help bridge all of that. So hopefully it helps with it. So that's a little bit about me. So important do's and don'ts. That's really for a much broader audience. You know, like I said, we're going to be a little bit more intimate this morning, which is nice because we can have more of a conversation instead of somebody just presenting and somebody just. That part of that actually works out pretty well too. So relatively informal and low key, but hopefully the information you're going to find is still going to be helpful to you. I don't know if y'all can hear me okay. I can stand behind the lectern if you want, but if any of you have done presenting and stuff for a while, you eventually get to the point where you almost feel trapped behind it. That's right. All right, so topic overview today. Some of you that went to that attended the intermediate class, like I was saying earlier, some of the slides are going to be the same, but today you're going to get a lot more background information as to what goes on and why it's happening. And so instead of do this, it's going to be well, they're asking you to do this, and here's why. And this is some of the thinking behind it. Not that you're always going to agree with all of the thinking. When I was with the state, we always did not see eye to eye with our federal office. And you know, now that I'm in consulting, our clients don't always see eye to eye with the state. That's kind of the way it is. But at least if you understand where they're coming from, you can make an informed decision. So that's kind of what we're doing. So we're going to have a general introduction. We're going to go into permit content. And this is going to be at the more advanced level. We're going to be talking about source aggregation and project aggregation. That's always a big deal with companies, especially if you got multiple sites and you have multiple sites within a relatively tight geographic area. Are you a single source or are you multiple different sources? Is a question that comes up, and it's got pros and cons. We'll go over some of that. And the same thing for project aggregation, especially if you're a larger property, you've got a number of operating units. When should you pull everything together into one project, and when shouldn't you? That also makes a difference on triggering major NSR evaluations for things like PSD, non-attainment, stuff like that. We're going to go into a little bit of minor new source review, but not from the aspect of how it necessarily runs, although there will be some of that, but it's more of why do minor NSR programs exist? In my experience, both with the regulatory agency and now that I'm in consulting, how the EPA and states interplay with each other and why states are so different across the country has a lot to do with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about the origin of minor NSR programs, why they exist, and why you see some of the wide range of capabilities and wide range of requirements across the country that you see. So we're going to hit major NSR in this unit here. We're going to be talking about accommodated emissions. Some people call them demand growth exclusion. It's a very helpful technique. It can be somewhat convoluted, so we're going to take a little time to go over that this morning. It's definitely you like it or you don't like it type thing, but at least it's an option that I would like to let y'all know about. Other prevention of significant deterioration or PSD requirements. Most people think about PSD as a whole, and I got to do the ACT, and I got to do max modeling. There's actually other things that go along with it that a lot of times get overrun by the general conversation because they're just trying to convey what the ACT is about. But we're going to tunnel a little bit more into the program and let you know there's some other things with PSD that goes on as well. Then we'll dovetail that into non-attainment review, plant-wide applicability limits or PALs. Some companies really like them, others stay away from them, wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole. But I just want to let you all know what they are, kind of how they work. So if you ever have management or whatever that comes up to you and mentions a PAL, so number one, it's not a surprise to you, so you have a better understanding of what it is. And then you can have a reasonable conversation with management or with your employees, or whatever level you are with the company, and make informed decisions. Then this last one is going to be a little bit fraught with danger, but some of the recent federal policy shifts. That's a very interesting thing because these federal policies that were created with previous administration and that are being looked at now, some of the new ones completely negate some of the former ones, and there's a lot of stuff under review and evaluation. So we're going to go over some of the bigger memos that have come out, and some of them are still intact, and a couple of the EPA rules, at least one for sure, actually has been overturned through the continuing resolution, the CRA, that Congress does. So we'll talk about that. So one of our goals today is to help prepare complex permitting issues. I mean, for those of you in the business, you know that sometimes you're going to get one of those golly questions that comes in. You know, there's something surprising. I've been in this business for a while and I still get surprised. If I'm not surprised once a week or several times a month, I'm surprised. That makes sense. There's always something coming. That's what makes our field so dynamic. There's always things going on. So let's go ahead and get rolling into this. And so what we're going to do today is discuss and explain some of the complex issues, hope with understanding, and hopefully reinforce what you know. Since this is kind of an expert level class, we're going to presume that most of y'all have at least a good, decent working knowledge of how some of these programs are. And what we're going to help to do is remind you of some of the things you may have forgotten and to help advance and move that forward. That's kind of the goal. So permit content. Some very important things. Some people have a tendency to dive right into a permit. They're going to look at what the unit is, what the modification is, how do I do calculations. All of that is very, very important. I'm not trying to minimize that. But a lot of times in that rush, some of the bigger questions sometimes people forget to ask or think about. Are you in an attainment area or are you in a non-attainment area? That's going to make a big difference into what kind of applications you put together and will trigger some key things that you're going to be looking at in your reviews. Are you a new major source? Are you at an existing major source or are you at a minor source? And then major for what? Are you an attainment area, which means you may have PSD applicability? If you're in a non-attainment area, of course, you're going to be looking at VOC and NOx precursors to ozone. But if you're big enough in a non-attainment area, you may also have PSD. And NOx is actually a double threat. You can trigger non-attainment and PSD for that same pollutant. And the reason is NOx is an ozone precursor, so it's regulated through the non-attainment review program. And it also has a national ambient air quality itself through NO2. And so you can actually trigger PSD and NOx at the same time. It's rare, but I've seen that a couple of times. Slightly off topic here a little bit for today, but just to make sure we got a complete rounding out. Hazardous air pollutants, specifically MAC standards under NESHAP's Part 63. You don't see it as much today anymore, but when I've been around long enough to where when the MAC program was getting rolled off, if you had a MAC standard that you were applicable to, you would apply that MAC standard. But if you were emitting a HAP and a MAC standard had not been issued or promulgated yet, they have this nice little section in 40 CFR 63 rules called 112G, and that's a case-by-case MAC review, which is basically an NSR permit, but you're doing it to protect HAPs in the MAC. And so it's rare now, I think, that you see those because a lot of MACs have already been issued, but there's some that they haven't completed yet. And so it's not an impossibility that depending on what your HAP is, you may not have, to look at a 112B type analysis. And of course, from the federal standpoint, NSPS and NESHAPs and resource performance standards under 40 CFR 60. And then there's actually two different types of NESHAPs, which is your national emission standards for hazardous air pollution. That's the way the EPA does the air toxic survey. A lot of states have their own minor NSR reviews where they do health effects and they do air toxics. That was really, really hard for the EPA to do at a national level, and they could never get agreement on it. And so what they wound up doing is they wound up writing these all-encompassing rules for everybody in the country. And then the rest of it, they rely on the state by the NSR programs. And so there's actually two NESHAPs. There's a Part 61, which is kind of the original NESHAPs. And those are geared towards specific pollutants. And then the newer incarnation of that is the 40 CFR Part 63, commonly known as MAC standards. And those are more industry type, where Part 61 is for the pollutant. Part 63 is more towards operations. So refineries, certain kind of chemical plants, certain kind of metal treating plants, and things like that. So the Part 63 MAC standards are still looking at HAPs. So they're still going after the hazardous pollutants, but in a slightly different way. And those will definitely influence a permit application as well. And these are things that when you come up to a state minor NSR program and you're permitting, these are the big ticket items they're going to be looking at, in addition to what are you modifying, how you're doing your calculation. Because this kind of dictates the kind of rules that they're going to take your application and compare it to. And then don't forget, we've got 50 states in the country. Every one of these programs are different, and they've got their own rules. And so keep in mind that you also got state requirements as well. Like in Texas, we got Chapter 115 for VOC controls in an unattended area. We got Chapter 117 for those. And then other states have other different rules too. But from the big ticket national items, these are the kind of things that a lot of the state minor NSR programs are going to be looking at. So first breakout, I guess, is going to be source aggregation. And this is what the EPA commonly uses to determine whether your source is a major source. And they break it down into these three basic areas here. First is you could be a common source if you're under the same standard industrial classification or SIC code. Most people can go back and there's a SIC code for refining, one for chemical. They're pretty broad, but you can go and look at the EPA websites or just Google SIC, and they give you the rundown, and then you would go back and look at your industry type and see if you fit one of the SIC codes. Where a lot of the conversation has been happening for source aggregation is these last two bullets here. Operations must be located on adjacent properties, and they must be under common control. Those two topics have actually varied a little bit over time, depending on the administration, depending on who was running the EPA, and what their broader viewpoint was. And as we go into the conversation, you're going to see that it kind of drifted around for a while. And I'm not going to say that drift has finished, but we do have some other EPA memos of how they are interpreting it today. And we'll go into some of that. So why is source aggregation important? Well, source aggregation is grouping different sources. And keep in mind, when the EPA talks about source, what they really mean is plant site. for the rest of us here Earthlings. And so there's a different language. The source means something different to the EPA than it does to many minor in-soil programs. And so keep that in mind too, that there's a language barrier, so to speak. So there's a little bit of interpretation that goes on when you're talking to either a state regulator or a federal regulator. When you say source, when you say major, they are geared and trained to receive it in a certain way. So how you have that conversation with them will definitely bridge that gap and either help understanding. And if you're thinking X and they're hearing Y, it's going to get messy. So just kind of keep that. But if you ungroup these and you have individual sources, then the EPA is going to look at just that site. They're not going to take 3 or 4 sites together and combine them into one source. And so that means that if you ungroup them, you may not be major for PSD or non-attainment. You might not even need a Title V for them. But on the flip side of that, ungrouping them means that each one of these individual sites are going to be standing alone. One of the nicer things, I guess, about a bigger source is you've got a lot more facilities, you've got a lot more equipment, you have more increases and decreases, which means you may have reductions or an easier way of creating reductions if you need to either avoid PSD or non-attainment or develop offsets. And so there's some advantages to having a bigger combined source. And there's also some disadvantages. But what most people were trying to do most of the time, I think, is the more stuff you put together, the more complex it gets. More likely you have a triggering PSD, non-attainment. And so I think my experience has been that most people would try to keep it at the smallest interval or smallest level as possible to help maybe avoid some of these things. Little bit of history on this one. 2012, Summit Petroleum versus the Environmental Protection Agency. There was a time when the EPA, in definition of whether you were different sources or combined one source, they would look at functional interrelatedness. And so if you did something at one location and you transferred material over to another location, the EPA got to the point of saying there is a functional interrelatedness to these two operations. Both of these sources are now going to be combined into one. We're going to treat them as one problem. And so, and they did that for a while. When I mean a while, probably 10 or 12 years ago. There's a lot of companies that wound up having individual sites combined into a common source. And so some of the companies were going back and saying, why is that? Where are you getting the authorization? Why are you using functional interrelatedness? We can't even find that in the rule in place. It's not the CFR. Is it a policy? How are you coming about it? So they actually challenged it. And what the court did is they went back and they looked at it and they said, okay, what really happens when you're combining sources, it gets back to that first word we were talking about earlier, which is adjacent. Are you adjacent? And adjacent sources that have interaction with each other, doesn't that necessarily make them one source? Summit Petroleum, in this case, actually had sources that were 8 miles apart. The EPA said, nope, no problem. Here in Texas, I've actually seen the EPA do that back in the day, so to speak. They were 24 miles apart, and the EPA came back and said, you're one property. And so what this court case actually did is the court went back and they looked at adjacent, they looked at physical proximity, and they looked at what some of the original Clean Air Act intent was back when Congress designed and constructed all of this back pre-1978. And what they found out, the court said, is that, functional interrelatedness, even though the EPA does that in policy, they disagreed that that's the way it was always intended. But the core rules basically went back and said, if you're adjacent, you may need to combine these together. And so the court basically said that this definition, this concept of adjacent, is physical proximity, does not necessarily result in functional interrelation. So that was kind of the first big pushback to how the EPA was doing it. September 2018, the EPA actually issued a draft guidance memo interpreting adjacent for new source review in Title V, other than oil and gas. Oil and gas is kind of a separate animal, They have slightly different NSR rules that run them. And because you got different sites connected by pipelines, and you got compression stations, and dehydration stations, they're a little bit different animal compared to a refinery or a big chemical plant or something like that. And so they actually broke oil and gas out. Those are handled differently under the federal rule. We're going to get into that a little bit here. There is going to be some more guidance that's going to come across. I can tell you, preview, not spoiler here, but there's still some questioning. Even though they made it better and the intent was finally resolved to a higher degree of definition by the courts and by recent EPA actions, to go back and say it's a slam dunk case and that all the questions are taken out of it, I can't say that. There's definitely cracks in all of this stuff where somebody can come back. So it's not locked down. It's more identifiable than it was before, but it doesn't mean it's completely resolved. But what the EPA was doing in this draft memo, they were saying for all industries other than oil and gas, interpretation of adjacent only considers physical proximity and does not include functional relatedness. We need to be careful there because you're going to find out later that there's a caveat to that. But that's what the memo was basically saying. And they kind of generally defined adjacent. And this kind of gets back to the question that you were asking. Adjacent is operations that do not share a common boundary or border or are not otherwise physically touching each other are adjacent. And so that takes into account if you've got plants on each side of a highway, or if there's a railroad running through your property or something like that. Just the fact that there's a highway or a railroad running through the property, that doesn't necessarily mean that you got one source on one side of the track and another source on the other. They can still be the same. But the EPA was talking about proximity there. They did not define what that distance was. That's where things start to get kind of interesting. So they said you need to be adjacent. You need to be close to each other, which basically means the two properties don't necessarily have to touch. But how far is far enough, or how close is too close? That is still an open question. But what the EPA did say is that operations in question are truly physical proximity to each other. It generally conveys the concept of being side by side or neighboring, is the way the EPA memo was written. So you don't get the feeling that you can be 12 miles away and it's your province. The indication is that you need to be pretty close to each other, not in a different county or not, and so forth. So there could be some limited with allowance made by some limited separation, for example, a right of way, and that's where the highway or the railroad comes in. But they also said this: the determination must ultimately comport with the common sense notion of a plan. And so it's rare, but sometimes a company is going to make a final product. They got the reactors over here, and then they'll pipe it 3 miles over, and they got another part that's going to finish it off into their final product. EPA has argued that neither one of them can stand alone. That is your plan. You just maybe didn't have enough room over here, so you built the rest of it over there. But that is still your plan. And so it's got to be the common sense notion of a plan. And sometimes I have found out that can get confusing with functional interrelatedness. So that's just something to keep in mind, that these are not unchallengeable type assertions that a company may be making in a permit application. But I think what most people are doing is they're looking at it and say, okay, do we have a production facility over there in which we send it over there, and they're going to, another site, and they're going to package it and stuff like that? They're no longer finishing it, so could that be another source? Could that be another site? Or if I started over here and I need to finish it over there, and my final product is being sold over there, does that mean that both of those sites now have a common sense notion of the plan? In other words, you would have done that on the first property if you would have had enough of the property. So that's kind of the things that some of the regulatory agencies are going to be looking for. November 26th, EPA released another memo, and this is quote unquote a more final memo, right? The first one was a draft. Some people consider it to be more of a white paper. They were putting ideas out there of what they wanted. But in 2019, they actually released a memo, new source review and Title V source determinations. In this memo, the EPA said they looked at the past actions and court decisions. They looked at all of the information they got on that draft memo that we just got finished talking about. And then they determined the best approach. And it kind of gets back to what we hinted to begin with. They went back and they said, you know, when all of these rules were originally developed back in the late 70s and early 80s, they were really focusing on proximity to determine whether they were adjacent or not. They weren't necessarily focusing on interrelatedness of these different systems. And so it made it harder for the EPA to come back and say, these two units work in consort somehow, so we're going to automatically put them together. And so there is some explanation, there is some way if the EPA comes back and tries to say, we think you're one source, you can say, well, what about the proximity argument? And then it would be up to you to try to make a discussion point of why they are not a common source. And so we got part of the way there. Now there's something at least tangible to grab onto. Beforehand, where there was just a lot of people saying, well, I think this and I think that. This brought a little bit more definition. So the net result is proximity is basically equal to adjacent. Common sense notion of a plant is in play. Keep in mind that neither one of these terms are necessarily defined in the regulation. So that was another thing that the courts and the EPA kind of looked at. And again, it's physical proximity, but the EPA did not define a distance of what that means. So there's still room there for distance and common sense notion of a plant. But I think more people have a better idea of what a plant is and what you're making and what the final end product is versus plants that belong to the same company that may share raw materials and feeds back and forth. Now you have something a little bit more to address on. And that's one of the big takeaways from some of the things that was going on. And then finally, the EPA will not invoke the existence of functional interrelationship to establish a kind of where they were going. This letter, this memo, was from the EPA to the regional administrators. So if you pull it up, look at the date, you can actually read it. It's available online. And they asked the EPA administrators to share it with their states in the region that they're charged with. And they also said it does not affect prior decisions that were based on functional interrelatedness. So they're not going to go back and recreate. So if somebody has two different plant sites that were put together in one source, because of functional interrelatedness, the EPA says we're not going to go back and argue that one over. And so it's really going to be difficult, I think, to use these memos to go back and unwind something that's already happened. But looking forward, you know, things, these kind of decisions, these kind of memos out there, maybe something that could be closely evaluated. EPA also, I love when they do this. Guidance is not promulgated through notice or rulemaking, and that's true, it's a memo. So it doesn't carry the same weight as rule, it doesn't carry the same weight as law. Some people would argue about how legal that is and whether that force mandates activity or not. The EPA is just basically saying this is how we are going to administer this program from the EPA. And since it wasn't published in a rule and it's not part of a law, they said challenges to this guidance will come through permitting decisions or the permitting process. And so basically they're saying, this is what we want to do. We recommend that the states do the same thing. States normally have to go, many of them have to go through some kind of public notice or public comment process through their permits. the EPA is basically going to wait and see if there is pushback if it comes from that action. So that's kind of how they got that. The second part of that whole source aggregation, in addition to adjacency, is common control. And that's another big furball that people get involved in. Who controls what? So are you adjacent or not? And then even if you're not adjacent or within that undefined distance, who actually controls and makes the decisions? That's also one of the things that goes into, are you a common source or not? So there was another memo that the EPA issued April 30th, 2018. I don't know exactly what was going on, but Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, you're going to find out there's going to be a number of memos and a number of EPA criteria that came out of different things that were happening in Pennsylvania. Kind of interesting. So the first memo was a discussion of common control, Meadowbrook Energy, and Keystone Sanitary Landfill. The landfill was generating landfill gas, and they were sending it over to the power plant. They were burning the landfill gases. Historically, common control was a multi-factor approach, and the EPA looked at, do you have shared workforces and management? Do you have shared equipment, intermediates, and byproducts? Do you have shared pollution control? Are you starting to operate more as one entity than two different entities? Do you have support and dependency relationships? Well, here we're going into support and dependency again, which tried to muddy the waters a little bit about do you have interrelatedness? And so as you see and work through these memos, just when you think clarity is finally being added, there can be a little bit more confusion. So it's going to be interesting to see moving forward how all of these things play out. But for common control, the EPA basically went back and said, okay, we're going to look at certain key points. First one in common control is dictating decisions. And they specifically said requires the power to dictate a specific outcome, not just the ability to do. So if you got two different sources and you're on source A, there's another property over there that's source B, can you suggest to them, we would really like you guys if you could do this for us? Versus the ability to say, here's what I want you to do. Now you're starting to operate more like one source again. That's what they were saying. The decisions that affect compliance with air pollution regulatory requirements. Can one source tell the other source how they're going to comply, how they're going to monitor, what they're going to do, or can they only suggest? And so does the responsible official have the ability to sign off on compliance issues on the other product, on the other product? If the answer is yes, and you can also tell them what to do, it's starting to look more and more like your one source. Now you're falling back of, do we meet the common sense notion of a plan? Otherwise, if you have no control over them, you can ask, you can beg, you can request, but you can't tell them what to do. Now you have a better potential of being considered two different properties. Yes.
So, like you said, source A may be a bigger source, like a manufacturing plant. Source B may be a smaller, like kind of supportive. But they are controlled by different parties. But if source A, they can tell, I want to suggest you to do this, to do that for me.
Right.
But it's not through administrative. Like source A does not officially own source B, but it kind of like source B is economically dependent on source A. If they don't listen to source A, they go bankrupt.
Right.
So in that case, do you say the source A is dictating instead of more recommending?
Well, that gets interesting. And I don't know if everybody heard the question or the comment, but what he was talking about is if you got source A and they work with source B, and source B is there and they rely on source A, and if source A went away, source B would go away. Does that necessarily exert common control or ownership over that? And I think the answer, at least from what I can tell, is more of along the lines of independent. Because if they're truly independent companies, If source A goes away, source B is just going to, they're just going to find a different supplier for what they're doing. They may be comfortable with source A, they may have a good price, they like the relationship, you got, trucking going on or pipelines or something going on. But do they comport to the common sense notion of the plan? And so if source B can say, okay, source A goes away, source B says, okay, I'm just going to go, 3 levels down the road here. I'm just going to buy it. I'm going to keep working. I like working with you, but I don't need you. Then that starts to break down that common ownership and control, and maybe even potentially breaks down that functional common sense notion of a plan. But if source A goes away and source B is stuck, they got nothing else they can do, they have to shut down too. Then I think that also brings in common control, but proximity of home. My understanding is that if they are truly 2 different companies with their own management, their own entities and stuff like that, unless there's a common sense notion of a plan going on there, I don't think, at least the way it seems, that the EPA is automatically going to rope them together and say, if that happens, that means you're one side. I'm going to stop short of saying that. I think there's some room for challenge. We'll just have to wait and see what future memos and stuff like that show. Because the EPA basically said, and this is something to think about, dependency relationships. If you look at the CFRs, there is something called a support facility. And so you still may wind up